What's up, sports fans? This is the Lucas Ross Sports Channel. We continue with our 2025 college football schedule preview and very early projected record series. The Kentucky Wildcats are up next. Before we look ahead to 2025, let's take a look back at what Kentucky did in 2024. Here are my projections and predictions last year for Kentucky. My projection and prediction for this Kentucky team was both the same. Projection was 7-5, and then my prediction for them was also 7-5. Kentucky obviously did not end up, obviously not even, living up to those expectations, is what I meant to say. They went 4-8 last year, so a pretty rough year for Kentucky. It's not really just about the record. I'm a Kentucky fan, so I wasn't really disappointed by the fact that the record was bad. It was because of the schedule that they played in the SEC. Now, obviously, they don't get a tough non-conference schedule. The only tough non-conference game that they play is probably Louisville, so they don't really play any other Power 4 team besides Louisville in the non-conference, but the SEC schedule is really what kind of bothered Kentucky, and the expansion with Oklahoma and Texas. They had to play Texas, of course, on the road. You look at the schedule, though, from last year for Kentucky. Again, a big reason why I think they went 4-8 is because of how tough the SEC schedule was. But first off, you look at who they played in the non-conference. They played Southern Miss, Ohio, Murray State, and then, of course, Louisville. They play Louisville every year because of the rivalry and everything in the Governor's Cup. And really, they have dominated Louisville as of late. They won like 5 years in a row, and then Louisville finally snapped that streak, and Kentucky definitely wasn't a great team last year, and they just had a pretty tough schedule. Again, you look at this SEC schedule from last year. First off, you look at who they played at home. They played South Carolina, Georgia, Vanderbilt, and then also Auburn. So not a tough home schedule, but South Carolina and Georgia were really two tough games. They were competitive against Georgia for the most part, but they lost that game by 1 point. So really close to beating Georgia. And then on the road, they played Ole Miss, Florida, Tennessee, and Texas. So yeah, that's a very brutal road schedule right there. But they beat Ole Miss, and we thought after that game on September 28th, we thought Kentucky was actually going to turn things around and actually make it to a bowl game. But yeah, Kentucky just went downhill from there. They lost every game from October 12th to all the way to November 23rd in the SEC. Yeah, they beat Murray State, but I'm talking about the SEC schedule. So yeah, this schedule was very tough for Kentucky last year, and I think that's the reason why they went 4-8 and had a pretty rough year for 2024. Does the schedule get much easier for them in 2025? Well, it really doesn't. You just flip the home and away in the SEC, but the non-conference is different. So let's go to their non-conference schedule. Of course, the non-conference schedule is not going to be tough, but you look at this non-conference schedule, they're going to play Toledo, Eastern Michigan, Tennessee Tech, and then on the road at Louisville. So I talked about Louisville. They play them every year, of course. That's not going to change. They played that game on the road this year. So yeah, that could be a pretty tough test there. Louisville obviously is a program that's kind of getting back on the rise. But you look at this Toledo team. This is not going to be an easy game for Kentucky. Wouldn't be surprised if, Kentucky is probably, favored by even by a couple of touchdowns. Toledo was actually a pretty good team last year at the Group of 5 level. So again, they may not be as good as they were last year, but Kentucky definitely will still be favored, but not by much, let's be honest. And then you got Eastern Michigan and Tennessee Tech, possibly your two easiest non-conference games for Kentucky. Again, it's not a tough non-conference schedule. They do play like 3 cupcakes. Again, I talked about Toledo not being a cupcake, but you got Louisville, that Power 4 game that they play every year. So yeah, that's your non-conference schedule. Let's now take a look at their home games in the SEC. And again, the home and away is flipped in the SEC. The teams that they played on the road last year, like these 4 teams, they will play them at home this year. And then the teams that they played on the road, or I should say at home, they will play them on the road this year. But at home, they'll play Ole Miss, Texas, Tennessee, and Florida. That's a pretty tough home schedule. Ole Miss may not be as good as they were last year. They beat the Rebels, so maybe they have an opportunity to do that 2 years in a row. I mean, obviously, Florida is a big game that they play every year. Tennessee and Texas, though, those are going to be 2 tough games there. Those are possibly like playoff contenders and definitely like top 10 and top 15 teams. Texas definitely top 5. Tennessee probably just inside the top 10. But yeah, that's your home schedule. Let's go back, or actually let's go to the away schedule now. They will play on the road at South Carolina, at Georgia, at Auburn, and then on the road at Vanderbilt. So this road schedule could be a lot worse for them, but this road schedule is still very tough for them. South Carolina, Georgia, and Auburn, very tough places to play. Yeah, that Georgia game is going to be absolutely tough for Kentucky to win. South Carolina, maybe they can probably win that game somehow, but Auburn, that could be a winnable game for Kentucky, but this is a very tough road schedule. But obviously Vanderbilt, not a very tough place to play. They can absolutely beat Vanderbilt on the road. So that's your away schedule. Let's go back to the schedule now and go full game by game now for Kentucky. They will start things off with Toledo on August 30th, and then they open up SEC play rather early in week number 2. They'll play Ole Miss at home on September 6th, and then they play Eastern Michigan after that on September 13th. And then they got a bye week here before playing on the road at South Carolina on September 27th, and then they go on the road to play Georgia on October 4th. So that first bye week is not at a really good time. Their bye weeks are at a very strange time in the season. But yeah, they got back-to-back road games with South Carolina and Georgia. That is very brutal there, right there, playing both of those games on the road. And then they get another bye week after playing Georgia. Maybe this is a good spot for the second bye because you're playing Texas the next week at home on October 18th. I shouldn't say the next week. You get a couple weeks to prepare for that game. But it's right after playing a really tough, hard-fought game against Georgia, so maybe they need that time to recover from that game. And then after that, they'll play Tennessee at home on October 25th, so they got back-to-back home games there with Texas and Tennessee in the month of October. Then on the road, it will be Auburn on November 1st. They come back at home to play Florida on November 8th. Tennessee Tech at home on November 15th, and then on the road at Vanderbilt on November 22nd to close out SEC play. And then they close things out in the regular season on the road at Louisville on November 29th. So they got back-to-back road games there, but it's in the non-conference in the SEC against Vanderbilt. So back-to-back road games to close out the season. Yeah, another tough schedule for Kentucky. Again, it's not really their non-conference schedule that's making this schedule tougher. Yeah, they got Louisville. That's a tough game, but I mean, they play them every year. That's not going to change, but the SEC schedule is making this schedule for Kentucky definitely a lot tougher for 2025, and it's definitely going to be a little bit difficult for Kentucky, in my opinion, to make it to a bowl game. But let's not get a projection here for Kentucky. This is the scale I'll be using here for their official projection. Basically a 1% game in the red, that's pretty much going to be counted as an automatic loss. 20% in the orange, that's where Kentucky will be about a double-digit underdog, so we're talking about 10 to 14 points, somewhere in that point range. 40% in the yellow, that's where they'll be a clear underdog by 6 or 7 points, so by less than a touchdown. And then 50-50 games, those will stay in the white, games that really can go either way. 60% in the purple, that's where Kentucky will be favored by less than a touchdown, so about 6 or 7 points. And then 80% in the blue, they'll be favored by double digits, 10 to 14 points. And then 99% in the green, that's pretty much your guaranteed and automatic wins. So we'll start with those guaranteed wins here for Kentucky. You got a couple of those. You got Eastern Michigan and Tennessee Tech at least. Eastern Michigan, though, maybe that is not going to be a pretty easy game either for Kentucky. They played Eastern Michigan in the past. That's kind of been a tough game for them, but they should be able to be big favorites in both of these games. I think these are definitely games that are definitely in that 95 to 99% range. Tennessee Tech is a team that they definitely should beat pretty easily. Here's the difference. They could probably just score like maybe 20 or over 30 points against Eastern Michigan. Then they could probably, score like 40 or 50 plus against Tennessee Tech. So yeah, that's kind of the difference there between those two games. But these are your automatic wins here for Kentucky. They're like guaranteed wins as of right now here in this projection. So yeah, you got your two easy wins right there on September 13th and November 15th against Tennessee Tech and Eastern Michigan. And then I'm going to put the Toledo game in the blue for right now. Toledo, again, a decent group of 5 team from last year. They could be probably good again. You never know. They could probably not be as good as they were last year. But yeah, Kentucky, they're playing at home in this one. I still think they'll be favored by double digits. They're definitely the better team, but they'll be favored only by like 10 to 14 points. So that's not a really high spread there, especially like for a team, out of the group of 5. So yeah, Kentucky, I think will be big, be favorites here by a couple of touchdowns against Toledo. It's not a guaranteed win just like the green games are, but it's still a win either way. And then you look at the rest of the schedule, you can't really favor Kentucky in the rest of their games, especially in the SEC. So let's go to games now where they're definitely going to be completely underdogs. You got one game in the red though, which is counted as an automatic loss. You got Georgia on the road. That's the only game I could see Kentucky not having having any chance whatsoever. Yeah, Georgia's on the road. I just don't really see them winning that game. And as an honest Kentucky fan, I just don't think they can beat Georgia. And look, I know last year's game was close. It probably should be in the orange. If it was at home for Kentucky, it would definitely be in that 20% range where they're just like a 10 to 14 point underdog. But yeah, they're definitely going to be a big underdog here against the Bulldogs of Georgia. And they're definitely not really clearly on Georgia's level. So yeah, Kentucky definitely going to be a big time underdog. That's pretty much counted as an automatic loss. And then you got two games in the orange where I think Kentucky is going to be definitely a double-digit underdog. You got Texas and Tennessee. Now, it's not really, saying that Kentucky is going to automatically lose. These are also counted as losses, but it does give them a slight chance to probably, maybe like a slim chance to pull off the upset, but not quite there in the yellow at 40%. But I think Kentucky will definitely be double-digit underdogs against Texas and Tennessee. They might have a chance against Tennessee more than Texas because of that rivalry and everything, but Texas definitely going to be a pretty tough one. So yeah, these two games, Kentucky will be double-digit underdogs in my opinion in both of them. And then you got 4 games in the yellow where Kentucky is going to be a 6 or 7 point underdog. These 4 games right here, they do have a chance to probably pull off an upset somewhere. You got Ole Miss, South Carolina, Florida, and Louisville. You got 2 games on the road, 2 games at home. They beat Ole Miss last year. They could probably beat them for the second year in a row. Ole Miss might not be as good as they were from last year because they're going to rely on so many transfers. Just looking at it, they lost so much production from last year. Florida could be a decent team. They could be a top 25 team. South Carolina and Louisville could be top 25 teams as well. But these 2 games are on the road, so it might be a little bit tricky for them. But, the Louisville game, they definitely have a big shot probably in that one. South Carolina might be a tough one just because it's on the road. But, yeah, Kentucky, I think all 4 of these games, they'll be less than a touchdown underdog by like 6 or 7 points. And then that's going to leave you with 2 50-50 games here for Kentucky. 2 50-50 games only for them. You got Auburn and Vanderbilt. These are 2 games that really can go either way. And I think Auburn might be favored just because they're playing at home. They'll probably be favored by less than a field goal, so about 4 points or less. And then maybe Vanderbilt, they're probably favored, but Kentucky, they are the better team than Vanderbilt. I know Vanderbilt beat Kentucky last year, but I wouldn't be surprised if Vanderbilt did that again for the second year in a row because Vanderbilt seems like they're on the rise. I'm not saying they're going to be really great as a team, but they could probably have a pretty good, decent season. So yeah, Kentucky, I think they'll probably be underdogs maybe in both of those 50-50 games, but nonetheless, they'll have a big shot in both of those games. So what does the projected record come out to be here for Kentucky based on how tough this schedule is? Well, we count the green games as wins, and then you count that one blue game as a win as well against Toledo. You count the Georgia game as a automatic loss, and then you count the 2 games in the orange also as losses. Average out the 4 games in the yellow at 40%, and then you average out these 2 50-50 games at 50%, and odds would say they probably win at least one of those 2 50-50 games, and then plus you got your 3 wins in the green and 1 game in the blue. That's going to give you a total of 4 wins, so that is what the projection is for Kentucky. It's 4-8 for 2025. Again, that's a very low projection, but it doesn't shock me because of how tough this schedule is, especially in the SEC. Again, you're talking about South Carolina and Georgia back-to-back road games, and then you got some very tough games at home with Texas and Tennessee, which obviously they'll be double-digit underdogs, but I think they'll have a really good chance to beat Ole Miss or Florida. If they could probably win one of those 2 yellow games or probably split them, they could probably win 2 out of the 4, and that's going to give them the 6-6, and then obviously they'll win one of those 50-50 games. They could probably get to 7-5. I mean, that would definitely be a really good case scenario there for Kentucky, but I think best case as of right now, 5-7 here for the Wildcats, and then worst case probably 3-9. If they go 3-9 or worse for 2025, I think Mark Stoops is probably going to be fired at the end of the season, and that's really kind of tough to say as a Kentucky fan myself. But yeah, Kentucky 4-8 is the projection for them in 2025. Do you guys agree or disagree with this projection? Give me your thoughts about Kentucky down in the comments below. Thanks for watching this video, and stay tuned for more sports content videos on my Lucas Ross Sports YouTube channel.